Let's go live. We are live. We are live. And we are back. And I asked John and Julia to kind of join us so they could hear some of the discussion. We started with 220, which is the per pupil spending. And there is, I would say, a fair amount of concern with the per pupil amount, because if you lose a student that's weighted for poverty and English as a second language, and maybe you pick up another student with no weights, that skews your cost per student, you know, that, and you don't really control if, and Senator Chittenden, you can fill that in with your family of 5.
Yeah. I think two things surface, and so one thing exactly what the chair is speaking about, which is I think there is a valid concern about the volatility in smaller districts when absolute pupil numbers could change. And so Senator Beck not mentioned a notion, really two notions percolated. One, I guess there might be precedent for it previously, where imagining a district that has a decrease in pupils, if there was a backstop so that the amount that they wouldn't be penalized even with the smoothing function to get less money allocated to them than what they spent the previous year. That he seemed to speak to the fact that that has been a construct in another discussion or so on. The construct of the 5 kids is the testimony from one is if you take a small district that loses 5 pupils, and that's the $10,300 times it, that the pupil amount that they get that year, that represents a much larger proportional amount of decreased spending capacity than 5 kids that leave a really large district. And so that the concern is if, you know, a small district in its current construct loses a multi-unit housing complex, or even just a large family leaves, or other factors that could be affecting that area, some sort of backstop or catch. So that district would have some sort of smoothing. Did that speak to your?
Yeah, I think what they're wondering is, we've got the per pupil spending. Could it be either the per pupil spending or your overall education spending can't go up more than, because the per pupil spending can be a lot more volatile than your overall. And then the other thing that came up is there's always going to be something we can't imagine. So could there be an appeal? We did it to the Secretary of Education on minimum school size or class size, but just an appeal process, and maybe either or kind of thing with school, either for pupil spending or overall ed spending, because we got Roxbury, Montpelier, I don't think is having, is not going up in their spending, but Roxbury's tax rate's going up something like 34%. That's the CLA. It's weird out there.
I have a thought, but I don't want to jump in there.
Well, okay. Oh,
yeah. Have you guys modeled this kind of proposal, but doing it on a not on a per pupil basis, but on a total education spending basis? Because one of the concerns that I have, and that came up in the discussion, is that this is very, very dependent on change, because it's weighted pupils, and you could have a change in data. The changes at the federal level are potentially going to change our poverty data, with the direct cert being less direct and certified. And then if you have students who are just you lose a couple ELL students, it could have a huge impact on the district, because that weight is so big. So doing it instead of on a weighted per pupil, on a total education spending and applying a percentage to that instead.
Julie Richter, JFO. I understand the idea. I haven't done that modeling. It could be done. And I can work on it and come back to the committee about what that would look like. A couple of just general preliminary thoughts, or do you want to go?
You're good.
One piece is, and I haven't listened to your conversation, so maybe you've already explored this. It is the per weighted pupil spending is a long-term weighted average daily membership. So it is the average over 2 years. So the impact and change in weights won't be felt as acutely as it would be if it wasn't a weighted average. That being said, I understand the concern you're raising.
I would just say that 2 years is not very long term. That's pretty short term, medium term. So
The official.
I know.
A few things statutory language. And then the other piece I would say in terms of the appeal process, the first thing that comes to mind is there was the tax rate review board that was set up during the transition for Act 127. Remember, this was the 5% cap transition, but there was also the piece of it where if your district ed spend, I don't know if it was ed spend or weighted ed spend, but if some figure grew by more than 10%, you wouldn't be eligible for the transition unless you went before this tax rate review board. So that's the first structure or type of structure that comes to mind.
The backstop.
And from a fiscal perspective, that would be, I don't see any challenges in adding that to the modeling.
what do you mean by a backstop? I can't remember what that.
So I'd love for Senator Beck to chime in on this, because I thought you were saying that this is something that's come up previously, but imagine that small district that loses a few ELL kids and then their proportional allocated amount with the allowable growth cap per pupil would bring their total budget permissible amount to be less than what they had in their budget the previous year, to basically to say, no, you would by default never have a lower allocated amount than your previous year. Is that a construct that you've seen in another bill?
Yeah, which I remember kicking it around in the previous committee, having a 2 buckets, you fit into one, whichever one you get the most, we would set that. I mean, I have a district this year that lost 9% of their long-term leading exam. I mean, if they didn't have that protection of saying, but you at least get what you spent last year.
How long though? Does it
Yeah.
phase out?
Say what does what pays out.
I guess for how long would they just continue to get that, even if they keep losing kids? Do they just keep staying at that budget in perpetuity?
Well, this is only a 2-year
Yeah,
proposal.
it's only a 2 year.
Yeah, it's only 2 years.
So, and we've done this before. We've done this with a major spike in
Yeah.
value that through your grand list. We've done it with a major decrease in value during the housing crash, that your tax rate can only go up or down X% a year. And this is only 2 years, so.
And they're not absolved from the tax rate that's calculated from the spending level. It has nothing to do with that.
Right.
But if the backstop is the prior year's budget, that again doesn't account for the fact that their costs are going up, sort of contracted costs, their fixed costs that we can't.
Education spending plus some percent or something.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
It's harsh to say last year's amount, because everybody's getting
Yeah, it's just a
increased. I was wondering if you played around a little bit, Julia, with changes to, I mean, we already have an excess spending threshold, which is meant to moderate the increases, and districts do take it pretty seriously. They don't want to go up above that threshold for the most part. Have you looked at changes to the threshold to bringing it down, what that impact would be in terms of?
Nothing that I'm prepared to speak about. Like,
Okay, yeah, that's fair, totally fair. Just because that is a construct that districts already are used to, they already use it, they already know how it works, et cetera, and it's not imposing something on top of. Because this proposal would keep the excess spending threshold and put a cap on it.
Yeah.
So how much could we do it? Could we do the same thing by just adjusting the excess
Just
spending?
walking the threshold down or something.
Yeah, and how would we do that? And then if we do walk that down, or do we do impose caps, another backstop that is potentially we could consider, and just throwing this out there, but is what could we exclude or should we exclude? Because in the past, we've excluded things from the excess spending threshold. For imposing a cap, instead of having a backstop, we could just say, your school construction or debt service is not included or whatever. is
We've
not
already
included.
excluded those decisions that were made before a certain date.
Yeah, but they're only for a certain date, so like, that could be another way of getting at it, is what do we exclude from the cap?
One factor of 73 removed all the exclusions.
Well, that's what happens to the excess spending threshold is it used to roll it up exclusions and starts to.
Right, and I'm not saying we exclude everything, I'm just
Yeah.
saying, are there things that would make it more palatable to those of us who are concerned about those things?
Clarifying question, Julia, when you, I think somebody said that, if we, did what's in 220th draft, it would save $67 million. Is that the number right?
the number is right.
Okay,
The framing, I would adjust slightly. And I would say the estimate is that if S220 were to be implemented in FY 27, based off of our FY 27 data, then we estimate it would save 67.5 million.
okay,
We can't forecast what school districts are gonna build into their budgets in FY 28.
okay. So that leads me to the question is that when you make that assumption, you're talking an apples to apples, long-term weighted exam because we know that the long-term weighted exam next year is not going to be the same as it is this year. It's probably going to
Be lower.
decay, go down a little bit. Okay, that's just, I just want to understand what the baseline calculation is there.
Dr. says, yeah.
Oh, John,
May I? John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I guess my first question was just in terms of thinking about the population volatility point. We have an existing law mechanism for dealing with population volatility. The hold harmless provision of the pupil weighting section, which is just currently under suspension. But under that, you can't have lower than 96.5% of your prior year weighted long-term membership. So you could tweak that number. You could remove the suspension of the hold harmless provision if you're just concerned about population volatility, and that would go into determining your per pupil spending. Totally separately, the second point I wanted to make was about if you make exclusions of like school construction payments or the like from, we typically think about the exclusion being from the excess spending penalty. And that's sort of meaningful because what it means is that the funds for that are raised across the state rather than more heavily shouldered on the district making the decision. But a cap is different than an excess spending threshold. So I don't know how an exclusion from a cap would really work because it would produce literally higher ed spending across the state and it would raise the per pupil spend. So just calling out that a cap is quite different from a threshold in terms of whether or not you can exclude. It's no longer an effective cap if you actually just write like it's not a limitation on the per pupil spend. But just to the population volatility, I think you could just remove the suspension of the hold harmless provision and consider changing that percentage if you wanted.
that was learned.
So, from just thinking about the context of the education fund, of course, John is right. He's always right. So
How do I get in
And-
that?
thinking about that from a fiscal perspective, And thinking about the way that the whole timeless provision works is essentially it creates phantom students, right? Where we are counting kids in districts where those kids do not exist.
They don't carry over.
And
They
in
don't
a,
carry over anymore. Good.
in a fixed system like the education fund, the more pupils you give in one district and the higher their weighted pupil count, the lower their per pupil spending, which means the lower their tax rate. So absent any other policy changes, this gets back to the pushing on the balloon. The school districts that are receiving these extra pupils will not be carrying as large of a share on their taxes than they would have if those extra pupils didn't exist. That's a policy decision if you want to do it. That's just the underlying mechanism.
Well, I think that's why doing this on a per pupil basis is somewhat problematic, because you either, if you try to create a backstop, you can either create phantom students by having that, or if you don't create a backstop, you punish districts for their weights changing or their things are out of their control. So that's why doing it on a total education spend, I mean, that's the thing, like the full budget, like you have a budget and you can't increase it by a certain percentage, the whole thing. And then there's a lot more give and take within it than on a per pupil basis, seems like.
Dick, I'm agreeing to a large extent of what you just said. And my question is though, from your familiarity with the last couple of years, how often does this happen? That this, if it wasn't suspended, that this would have triggered, like, is this a real thing to be concerned with, that the volatility is swinging the pupil count to be so noticeable in especially the smaller districts?
I don't think, I certainly don't know, but I think it's literally just a question of have population counts changed in districts and states.
So the only other piece I would add is we're currently in FY 26. FY 25 was the first year of Act 127, which changed the way certain pupils are counted. So we really don't have any time series data that we can compare now to pre-Act 127. And I can look into it, but I don't know.
Well, I do know, just as an example, Senator Shitten, that one of the districts in my Senate district, they got incorrect data from the agency, and that had a significant impact on the number of students that they were getting poverty weight for. And the agency was basically like, we can't really change it, so you're gonna have to eat it this year. And so when something like that happens, and it was like 100 students, it was not, it was a significant difference to them. If something like that happened and they couldn't change it because of a data error, then that's punishing that district for something that is just an error.
Which maybe you could just leave it alone and let there be an appeal to somewhere, and you can go in and say your data was wrong. Or you can go in and say, look, I lost 3, 4, Spanish or Chinese speaking students, and I got 3 middle class, English language speakers, and it's impacted my per pupil spending this way.
Yeah, I think that puts districts in the position where they're gonna have to reveal confidential data, especially the really small districts. Once there's a certain fewer,
10.
yeah, under 10, they won't, what is it?
11.
Under 11, they're not gonna be able to say, and to come in and say,
Well, the school, whoever. Somebody knows what their weighting is because somebody's giving them the weight.
Yeah, so the districts know, and they report that to the Agency of Education, and it becomes protected data.
Okay.
So,
I remember
And
when
they
it was
say
protected
based on
data,
our protected data,
but I remember looking at this, a number of years ago, more than once. In which you got the data, but without the individual identifying information associated with it. And as I recall, part of the purpose of doing that was to see are folks manipulating the number of people they have who have special education needs and the like, so as to get additional money. And what I know, I remember what alerted us to it was that the variation of districts right next to each other, just in terms of the amount of special ed and other kinds of things that district needed compared to the district right next door to it that had a similar kind of demographic. And I haven't looked at this, it's a number of years now, but it still wouldn't surprise me, but that still exists.
That's pre-Act 173.
Yeah.
They're all in census block right now.
Yeah.
I too really like the appeal idea. I also would like to know, is it infeasible for us to consider rather than 2-year smoothing, but 3-year smoothing? 2-year just does seem a little too short period of time. If there was going to be a major fluctuation, can we average it over 3 years rather than 2?
For a student count,
Yeah.
we'd have to create a new definition, but I don't know why you couldn't do.
But
do
this
that.
is only for,
But
this is only for 2 years, so if,
We
is
calculate
it worth,
3 years.
is it worth the effort for a 2-year
Well, it's
stopgap?
3-year rolling average instead of the 2 might be good policy no matter what.
Okay,
This was something, Scott, you might remember. I think, and Julia, we looked at this during the pupil weighting
We
study
did,
in Act
yeah.
127, because actually Wisconsin maybe still used to have a 3-year rolling
3-year.
average for that purpose, because it smooths everything out more than a 2-year average. And I think I remember at least talking about it during
It was,
pupil
yeah,
weighting,
we talked about it. Yeah.
to try to do that. Do you remember that, Julia?
I
Did you,
wasn't here then.
you weren't here?
During the
Feels
school
like-
week. I came in the November after the.
Oh,
Right.
Right.
I don't think it was ever modeled or anything, but it was definitely, who it really helps are these small districts that have a lot of volatility. They can go up or down 5 kids can blow their
Yeah.
budget.
I have a friend who moved out of Granville.
Yeah.
Her 2 daughters took out half of the 3rd and 4th grade class.
Yeah.
I mean, it was disclosed, but it was that small.
Yeah.
I think it really helps their planning too, because they can see it coming, and so then they can make more strategic decisions over 1 and 2 budget cycles.
Maybe. Now that you've heard the concerns, we can let you go contemplate and see if you can help us dig our way out of the hole. I mean, the concern is that, in really small schools, one family moving out, you
Yeah.
got weights attached and one moves in that doesn't, or nobody moves in,
Yeah.
that school through no fault of its own, but is getting significantly less money and is being held to.
Can we just confirm on this point, because I think this has come up a couple of times. We would talk about money variation in the foundation formula, right? Because the amount of money that you receive as a district is a function of your pupil count. But here we're talking about taxing capacity.
Right.
So I just want to make sure that
It's true.
that's the
Yeah, that's true.
understanding we have.
Thank you.
So it's changing rates rather than.
Yeah, it's changing rates. We're trying to hold down spending for 2 years while we decide where we're going or figure out how to get there. And we want to find a mechanism that won't let schools off the hook, but also won't penalize them for things way beyond their control. If the school burns down, you're going to need an appeals process. If the furnace dies, if you have X% of your students move, or go into a residential placement, those are things. Maybe you have some control over residential placement, but you don't really, it's not really a choice. We're going to buy new this year. And how do we protect schools from that? And maybe just an appeals process is easier. If something extraordinary happens, you can appeal to the Secretary of Education or her designee, or to the state board, but we've already given them several sets of appeals. But then there's some backstop in that somebody will look at your situation and say, yeah, you're right. We gave you bad data. We, you know,
I want to clarify one thing that, because the cap is on a per pupil spend, it can affect the max spending, but we are talking about a tax capacity concept. So what it's doing is shifting liability, but it does mean that if you had a different count, your per pupil figure would change as a result of that count, and then the maximum spend available would change. So it's hitting both. So it is sort of complicated, but I think you guys have identified like a couple of different ways of doing this that I've heard. So maybe I can summarize what I've heard. I don't know. So one is minimize volatility in population counts, which could be done either through a hold harmless or changing the duration over which you calculate the long-term membership rate. So it could be a 3-year count, or you could change the 96.5, whatever it is. Another is to say you get the greater of, right? This was something we just discussed earlier. You get the greater of.
the West
Right.
Robin is going.
So, or you could just say you're not gonna, there's a minimum spend below which you're not gonna go. So there's different ways to do the thing. And then you've also identified a tax review board, which I don't frankly know anything about, but I can learn about.
Yeah, when you say hold harmless, I still have nightmares about what happened to that weighting and hold harmless, and everybody, your tax rate couldn't go above 5%, but if you spent 10%, you had to go to this appeals board. So half the school boards in this state spent 9.9% and said, but our tax rate can't go up more than 5%, and I don't want to have to write any more things about that's a recipe for bankruptcy. It wasn't what was meant. It wasn't done in the Senate, but we didn't catch it. And this is 2 years, so there should be some backstop. But if we have to recalculate and for 2 years, it's just, I'm thinking maybe just an appeals process would do it, so that if something goes really off the wire, your school can come in and say, look, if you flatten that out, my per pupil spending is down this year.
Yeah, but we have to put in statute, like, what is that process? What are those criteria? We have to put in probably an appropriation for something.
And we probably have to put in,
Yeah.
I
staff to
think
do
we
it.
just tell the Secretary of Education to take care of it.
So I know that tax rates are calculated based on per pupil spending, so that we're trying to lower tax rates, but if we're trying to be more fiscal, have more fiscal oversight about budgets, nobody else has to budget on a per staff member basis. So what it seems to me an unfair thing. Why would we not look at it on a total budget perspective, like total education spending rather than per pupil? Then it avoids the whole problem of the weights and the 3 years versus 2 years, the whatever. It's just looking at it on a whole budget, and people have to budget within the big number instead of budget within a tiny fraction of the big number and say this is.
I guess what I'd say to that, I'm not opposed to what you're talking about. I feel like we need a mixed, balanced approach, but I think one of the macro problems that why we're spending so much time on this is we're seeing declining students. And so what I like about the per pupil aspect is if the school district is losing pupils, this puts downward pressure on their spending so that we start to right size and make decisions. But I'm not against thinking of other more comprehensive ways to also look at the total spending within that district.
But I think if they're losing pupils and they are hitting the sort of threshold where they can reduce costs because of losing pupils, then they should be doing it. You know, there are plenty of places where they're, you know, we've seen the data where the number of teachers has gone down. And that's because school districts are cutting teachers in order to. It is, the number of licensed teachers has gone down
The cost
over the last.
the pupil cost keeps going.
Well, the number of support staff has gone up, but as school districts have lost pupils, they've cut classroom teachers because they don't need as many classes. But as student needs have gone up, they've increased the support staff to meet those student needs through other mechanisms. And so school districts should, and I think are, cutting costs when they have enough pupils that they're like, okay, we've lost a whole class, so we can, you know, or we can combine and do a 2-3 classroom or whatever it is. And, you know, looking at a budget from a perspective of you're budgeting to this big number and we want them to hit that target is I think a fair way of looking at it for them, because they still are gonna have the building, they're still gonna have to pay the school buses, they're still gonna have to do their contracting costs, all of those things.
Would it be possible to hear from the sponsor of the bill as to why he structured it like this?
We can ask. I think what he said is, leave on the floor, that he didn't have pride of ownership and that we could play with it. He was trying to provide some tax relief. This doesn't say your spending can't go up. It limits how much it can go up for 2 years. So to get a long term, gotta recalculate all kinds of stuff, I think might not be worth it for 2 years. We could do your per pupil or your total spend. And let's see if Julia can do any calculations or runs on that. Plus put in an appeals process. And I'm sorry, this has a long way to go. I'm very happy just modeling what we did with the school size and saying the classroom class size, remember minimum class size, you got to appeal to the Secretary of Education and she'd work with you to figure.
Just take
This
that.
bill has got a long way to go, and if it's gonna see it to the end, I don't know. So I'd like to get it moving without getting it to be as complicated as that 60 or anything else.
I really like the appeal idea and then the 3-year rolling average. Would we have 3 years of data in the new LTADM for FY28?
So for FY 28, we could use 25, 26, 27.
So we would have to.
Yeah, one consideration with the 3-year rolling average, policy choice. And something to keep in mind is just like the general, how easy it is to administrate it and administer it, and how easy it is to calculate it. And if there's different weighted long-term memberships being used in different parts of the calculation, I could see it being challenging for a school district to try to understand which weighted pupil membership. And that being said, I don't know, I'm not the school district. And I wouldn't be able to do any modeling for a 3-year average because we don't have 3 years data yet with the new leagues.
First problem we have now, we could do a 2-year average, right? So they are gonna have that issue about knowing which numbers to use.
Which problem?
So there's the problem you just described about a school district not knowing which piece of the LTAWDM to use. We have that now because current law is 2-year rolling average,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
Yeah, so I guess I just mean like using different right now, current law uses the same weighted pupil count across tax policy. So It's for calculating your per pupil spending is a 2-year, or the extra spending threshold is a 2-year.
We should know.
Right, so I mean, that's the question, but I was reading it as you were thinking of changing everything to 3 years. Or were you thinking about just changing just this one piece of
I
3 years?
go either way.
Yeah, because I think Julia's right, that having it 3 years for some things and 2 years for another thing would be really confusing, so. Kind of an all or nothing, and that's what we were looking at with the pupil weighting study was what if we changed everything to 3 years, and. We ended up not doing it, but I can't exactly remember why.
I like 3, if we can do it 3 across the board.
But do we want to change it to 3 for 2 years before we go to a foundation formula? Like, that seems like something that is a lot to.
By the time the schools catch on.
Exactly.
One comment I'll say is,
Yeah.
what I see around here is if we get this, if this passes and this is in place for 2 years, I just would predict us likely to maybe extend it a year or 2 years after. Because whatever this master vision plan is gonna be, it's gonna take longer than we're anticipating in my opinion.
We won't know until we get.
Some of us said that last.
But anyway, I think we're looking for something that doesn't upset the apple cart, is fairly simple. So that it doesn't take schools 3 years to understand it. But that would give some flexibility in if something extraordinary happened that altered their per pupil spending, that there would be a way for some relief. Yeah, we've been at this all afternoon. We haven't agreed. This is the best we've gotten to, so I think that's what we're looking for. That's fine.
I don't know what I'm doing, but that sounds good.
So don't worry about it.
I'd love to see a 3-year rolling average for whatever makes sense across all the board and what that would look like. So if we're for everything else too,
No,
if that's a huge.
because people have other things. When we get to the future state, we could talk about 3-year rolling averages for everything. This is a 2-year temporary bridge. Okay.
Can I state less flippantly my last comment? I,
I don't know, and
what do y'all want? What do you want?
I think,
I couldn't.
I was trying to answer that question.
yeah,
so.
we're looking for an out for school who finds that their per pupil spending goes up
Okay,
a lot.
you want us thinking rather than
Right.
than bringing you something
Yes.
right now.
Yeah, it could be as simple as an appeals process and let the other body flush it out if they even get that far. Or it could be whichever is less your per pupil spending or your overall ed spending.
Okay.
Those are the two suggestions that came
The
up.
overall ed spending?
Right,
Yeah.
for the district,
Look at the overall.
Or your budget.
yeah, the district's education.
Yeah.
Yeah.
one thought about the overall ed spending. Is that if a school district saw. Most school districts have declining enrollment in the state. Some school districts have an increase.
Yeah.
So you may see school district that would have a higher cap if it were the greater of. That's a policy choice.
Yeah, just give them the greater of the two. So that,
Right, so for some districts, they would get more if it was on a per pupil basis because they're
Yeah.
increasing students, like maybe South Burlington, because they have a lot of housing going in there, as Scott and I heard this morning.
that was an awesome presentation.
Yeah, that was really great. Or it could be districts that are declining, in which case they would look at it on a full budget
Yeah.
basis.
Just not
Okay.
the fact stuff that you're describing.
Yes, Miss
Yeah, that's-
Senator Condos.
So
You
So.
always told us that we were doing 60. South Burlington has grown.
Grief when I talk about South Burlington.
Yeah, that's an impressive presentation. You should go back.
Okay. Thank you
Yeah.
for showing up and being willing to even listen to us at this hour of the day. We are